Money breaks people before they understand what it demands. It demands more than discipline. It demands preparation when nothing feels urgent. It demands restraint when everyone around you is spending. It demands that you see the pattern before the storm arrives. Most people ignore the warning. They live on the upswing, stretch their lifestyle during the harvest, then collapse when the lean years come. And the lean years always come. Joseph saw what others could not. He stood in Pharaoh's court, fresh out of a dungeon, and read a dream that Egypt's magicians dismissed. God revealed the pattern. 7 years of overflow, then 7 years of famine, so severe it would erase memory of the abundance. Joseph did not flinch. He gave Pharaoh a plan. Store 1/5 during plenty, distribute it during scarcity. Survive what everyone else would not. This is for education and spiritual reflection, not financial advice. But Joseph's wisdom was not just about grain. It was about seeing cycles. It was about humility before provision. It was about stewarding margin when it feels unnecessary. Most believers skip this part. They memorize verses about blessing, but they ignore the verses about preparation. They want overflow, but they resist the habits that sustain it. Genesis 41 lays out a framework that still holds, not because Joseph was clever, but because he operated in divine timing and submission. He did not chase wealth, he managed it. He did not hoard resources, he positioned them. He did not promise Pharaoh riches, he promised survival. These 10 principles pull from that same framework. They are not about guaranteed outcomes. They are about patterns that help create stability, margin, and the ability to weather what most cannot. Some will sound uncomfortable. A few will challenge how you think about income and control. But if Joseph's strategy saved a nation, the principles behind it can shift how you move through your own financial cycles. Store 1/5 during your abundance years. Most people spend what they make, then wonder why nothing is left when income drops. Joseph did the opposite. Genesis 41-34 records his advice to Pharaoh. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. 1/5. Not half, not everything left over, a consistent, disciplined portion set aside before the need was visible. This was not panic saving. It was strategic preparation during a season when everyone else was celebrating. The principle is not complicated. When income is strong, set aside a percentage before lifestyle expands to match it. Joseph stored grain in cities across Egypt while the land produced plentifully. And Genesis 41-49 says he stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. The margin came from consistency during ease, not scrambling during crisis. But the distortion is everywhere. People treat abundance like permission to upgrade everything. A raise becomes a new car payment. A bonus becomes a vacation on credit. The logic flips. Instead of storing during plenty, they borrow during famine and store nothing during harvest. 2 households can have identical incomes, but one builds a reserve while the other builds debt, all because of what they do when money flows easily. The principle is this: live below your peak. When income rises, resist the reflex to spend it all. Set aside 1/5 or more if possible, and let that margin become your buffer for the seasons you cannot predict. It is not about fear. It is about faithfulness to what God provides when he provides it. Stewardship starts in the years when it feels unnecessary. Interpret the warning signs before crisis hits. Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream saved millions, but the interpretation itself was a gift of discernment. Genesis 41-16 captures Joseph's posture. I cannot do it, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. Joseph did not rely on his own insight. He listened. He depended on divine revelation. And when God showed him the meaning, 7 years of abundance followed by 7 of famine, Joseph did not downplay it or soften the message. He told Pharaoh the truth plainly, then offered a solution. Discernment in finance works the same way. There are patterns you can see if you are willing to look: rising debt, shrinking margin, lifestyle creep, dependence on credit to cover normal expenses. These are not random. They are warnings. Proverbs 22-3 says, "The prudent see danger and take refuge, but the simple keep going and pay the penalty. The wise interpret the signs and adjust. The foolish ignore them until the crisis forces a reckoning." But many believers treat financial warnings like interruptions. They silence the conviction to cut spending. They dismiss the unease about debt. They assume the income will always be there. The job will stay stable. The economy will hold. Then the layoff comes. The medical bill arrives. The car breaks down. And the same people who ignored the signs now ask why God did not warn them. The principle: seek God's wisdom before the pressure hits. Pay attention to patterns in your spending, your debt, your dependence on things you cannot control. Adjust when you have time and margin, not when you are desperate. Joseph's interpretation came before the famine, and that made all the difference. Build a multi-city distribution strategy. Joseph did not store all the grain in one location. Genesis 41-48 says, Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Decentralization was the strategy. Spread the resources. Make them accessible. Reduce the risk of loss if one storehouse fails or one region is hit harder than another. This was not paranoia. It was practical wisdom under pressure. When the famine came, people in every region had access to reserves without traveling across the nation. The modern equivalent is diversification. Do not put all your resources in one income stream, one investment, one plan. Build multiple streams where possible. Have an emergency fund separate from your retirement account. If you are self-employed, do not depend on one client. If you work a job, develop a skill that can generate side income if needed. The principle is not about distrust. It is about reducing vulnerability. But the distortion is common. People put everything into one basket because it feels simpler. All their money in one account, all their security in one job, all their future in one plan. Then the layoff hits, or the account is compromised, or the plan collapses, and there is no backup. Others take the opposite extreme and scatter their resources so thin that nothing grows. They chase 10 side hustles, save in 12 places, and accomplish nothing because focus is missing. The principle: build intentional redundancy, not chaotic sprawl. Have a primary income and a plan for what happens if it stops. Have savings you can access and savings you cannot touch. Spread risk without losing focus. Joseph's system worked because it was organized, distributed, and managed with clarity. What do you think this principle changes first? Income or habits? Put it in the comments. Spend only 80% of what you earn. If you store 1/5, you live on 4/5. The math is simple, but the execution is not. Joseph's plan required Egypt to function on 80% of its production for 7 years. That meant less consumption during a time when the land produced more than it ever had. It meant resisting the cultural pressure to feast just because the harvest was abundant. Genesis 41-35 records Joseph's instruction. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This principle runs counter to everything the modern economy promotes. Advertising exists to convince you that 100% of your income is not enough. Credit exists to let you spend 120%. The system profits when you stretch, but stretching creates fragility. When income drops or expenses spike, there is no room to absorb the shock. The distortion shows up in two forms. Some people reject budgets entirely, convinced that restriction kills freedom. They spend everything, then blame circumstances when the margin disappears. Others obsess over every dollar, hoard compulsively, and never enjoy the provision God gives. Both extremes miss the point. Spending 80% is not deprivation. It is discipline that creates breathing room. The principle: choose a percentage, then build your lifestyle inside it. Let the remaining portion go towards saving, giving, and preparation. If 80% feels impossible, start with 95% and work down. The goal is not perfection, it is margin. Joseph's strategy worked because it was consistent, not because it was easy. Discipline during abundance is what makes survival possible during scarcity. Depend on divine wisdom over market trends. Joseph did not consult Egypt's economist or follow conventional strategies. He listened to God. Genesis 41-38, 3:9 records Pharaoh's response. Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. Joseph's authority came from revelation, not from human calculation. He saw what others missed because he depended on a source beyond himself. Financial decisions benefit from the same posture. Proverbs 3:5-6 instructs, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. This does not mean ignore wisdom or avoid planning. It means submit the plan to God first. Seek his direction before chasing the trend, the scheme, or the shortcut that promises easy wealth. But the distortion is rampant. People treat God like a financial advisor. They consult after they have already decided. They pray for blessing, then spend impulsively. They ask for provision, then refuse to budget. They want supernatural breakthrough, but they ignore the natural principles Scripture lays out. Others swing the opposite direction and become so spiritual they refuse to plan at all, calling it faith when it is actually presumption. The principle: pray before you spend. Seek counsel before you commit. Ask God to reveal where your blind spots are. Then obey what he shows you. Joseph's wisdom came from dependence, and that dependence positioned him to manage resources far beyond his natural ability. Divine wisdom does not replace planning. It directs it. Track your surplus until it exceeds measure. Joseph did not store grain carelessly. Genesis 41-49 says he stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. He tracked, he measured, he knew what was coming in and where it was going. Only after the surplus became overwhelming did he stop counting. The discipline came first, the overflow followed. This principle confronts the chaos most people live in. They have no idea what they spend, no record of what comes in, no clarity on where the money goes. Then they wonder why there is never enough. Tracking is not about obsession. It is about awareness. You cannot steward what you do not measure. But the distortion is predictable. Some people track compulsively and never trust God with the outcome. They hoard every dollar, stressed and controlling, afraid to give or rest. Others refuse to track at all, calling it legalism or lack of faith, when the real issue is avoidance. They do not want to see the truth of their spending because it would require change. The principle: measure your income, your expenses, and your margin. Use a simple system, a spreadsheet, an app, a notebook. The tool does not matter. The habit does. Know where you stand so you can make decisions from clarity, not emotion. Joseph's tracking created accountability. It revealed whether the system was working. And when the surplus exceeded measure, it became a testimony to God's provision and faithful management. Ration reserves to last the full famine. Joseph did not open the storehouses and let people take what they wanted. Genesis 41-55, 5-6 says, when all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, go to Joseph and do what he tells you. When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians. He controlled the distribution. He rationed the supply to last 7 years, not 7 months. He understood that generosity without wisdom is waste, and that stewardship sometimes requires saying no in the present to ensure survival in the future. This principle applies to anyone managing limited resources. An emergency fund is not permission to spend freely when stress hits. It is a controlled reserve meant to cover true emergencies, not impulse decisions. Retirement savings are not accessible income. They are rationed provision for a future season when earning capacity drops. But the distortion is everywhere. People drain their reserves at the first sign of discomfort. They pull from savings to fund a vacation. They cash out retirement to buy a car. They treat the buffer like discretionary income, then panic when the real crisis arrives and nothing is left. Others refuse to touch reserves even when the need is legitimate, paralyzed by fear that there will never be enough. The principle: define what qualifies as an emergency before the emergency happens. Decide ahead of time what reserves are for, then protect them. Joseph's rationing was not cruelty. It was calculated stewardship that stretched provision across the entire crisis. Rationing is not restriction, it is responsibility. Exchange value for value, avoid entitlement economics. Joseph did not give grain away for free. Genesis 47-14 records, Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. When the money ran out, he accepted livestock. When livestock was gone, He exchanged grain for land and labor. Genesis 47 to 23:2-4 shows the final arrangement. Now that I have bought you and your land for Pharaoh, here is seed for you so you can plant the ground. But when the crop comes in, give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. Exchange, reciprocity, value for value. This principle challenges the entitlement mindset that believes provision should come without cost. People want jobs that pay well but require no effort. They want businesses to succeed without risk. They want financial stability without the discipline of managing money. But Scripture consistently ties provision to stewardship, and stewardship requires responsibility. The distortion shows up as victimhood. People blame the economy, the employer, the government, the system, anyone but themselves for their financial position. They expect others to solve problems they refuse to address. They demand help but reject accountability. Or they swing the opposite direction and become transactional in relationships, keeping score of every favor, viewing people as resources to extract value from instead of image bearers to serve. The principle: offer value, expect responsibility, and steward what you receive. If you want better income, build better skills. If you need help, receive it with humility and give back when you can. If you manage resources, do it with fairness and integrity. Joseph's system was not exploitation. It was survival economics under extreme pressure, built on exchange rather than entitlement. Convert crisis into strategic positioning. Joseph did not waste the famine. Genesis 47 to 22:1 shows the outcome. So Joseph bought all the land in Egypt for Pharaoh. The Egyptians, one and all, sold their fields because the famine was too severe for them. The land became Pharaoh's. What could have destroyed Egypt instead consolidated power, centralized resources, and positioned the nation to recover stronger. Joseph turned crisis into leverage, not through manipulation, but through preparation and clear-eyed management during chaos. This principle is controversial because it can be twisted. Crisis does create opportunity, but exploiting desperation for selfish gain is not biblical stewardship. What Joseph did was manage resources in a way that preserved life and restructured a broken system. When others panicked, he had a plan. When others ran out, he had reserves. When others collapsed, he held position. The distortion shows up in two extremes. Some people see every crisis as a chance to profit at others' expense. They hoard during shortages to sell at inflated prices. They prey on desperation. That is not strategy. That is greed. Others refuse to act at all, paralyzed by guilt or fear, and miss legitimate opportunities to build stability or help others from a position of strength. The principle: prepare before crisis hits so you can respond with clarity when it does. When others are forced to sell, you may be able to buy. When others are desperate for work, you may be able to hire and provide stability. When others are panicking, you can steward calmly. Crisis reveals who prepared and who did not. Joseph's positioning was not luck. It was the result of 7 years of disciplined preparation. Steward assets as a delegated authority. Joseph never acted as if the resources were his. Genesis 41 to 55 records that when people cried out for food, Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." Joseph had full authority, but he operated under Pharaoh. He managed grain that belonged to Egypt. He distributed resources he did not own. He stewarded delegated authority with precision, accountability, and humility. His success was not measured by what he accumulated for himself, but by how well he managed what was entrusted to him. This principle confronts ownership mentality. Everything you have, your income, your home, your savings, your skills, is delegated. Psalm 24:1 says, "The earth is the Lord's, and everything in it. You are a manager, not an owner." The question is not whether you have much or little. The question is whether you manage it faithfully. But the distortion is deep. People hoard as if it all belongs to them. They refuse to give, refuse to help, refuse to release control because they believe ownership gives them rights over everything. Others abdicate responsibility entirely, treating God's provision carelessly because it's all his anyway. Both miss the point. Delegated authority means you are responsible for what you have been given, but you do not control the outcome or claim ultimate ownership. The principle: manage what you have, as if you will give an account for it, because you will. Luke 16:10 says, "Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much." Stewardship is the test. Joseph's faithfulness in Potiphar's house led to authority in prison. Faithfulness in prison led to authority in Pharaoh's court. Faithfulness in Pharaoh's court saved a nation. Stewardship compounds when it is rooted in submission, not control. Joseph's strategy was not about getting rich. It was about surviving what everyone else could not. He saw a pattern. He trusted the source of the revelation. He built a plan when no one else believed the warning. Then he executed it with discipline for 7 years before the crisis ever arrived. By the time the famine hit, the outcome was already decided. Not because Joseph was brilliant, but because he obeyed what God revealed and managed what God provided. Most financial teaching focuses on tactics, budget templates, investment strategies, side hustle blueprints. All of that has value, but it misses the deeper issue. The issue is not method, it is posture. Joseph operated from submission, not ambition. He stewarded provision, not ownership. He prepared during ease, not panic. His financial peace came from obedience to divine wisdom, not mastery of human systems. These 10 principles are not formulas, they are postures. Store during abundance. Interpret the warnings. Diversify your strategy. Live below your income. Depend on God's wisdom. Track what you steward. Ration your reserves. Exchange value for value. Position through preparation. Steward as a delegated authority. None of these guarantee wealth, but together they build the kind of stability that lets you sleep when others cannot. They create margin when others are buried. They position you to help when others need it most. The hard part is not understanding the principles. It is living them when everyone around you is not. It is storing when others are spending. It is rationing when others are feasting. It is submitting to God's wisdom when the market is screaming something else. It is managing faithfully when no one is watching and no reward is visible. Joseph spent 13 years in slavery and prison before he ever stood in Pharaoh's court. 13 years of faithfulness in obscurity. 13 years of stewarding what little he had, his integrity, his work ethic, his dependence on God, before the moment came when all of it mattered. The principles he operated under in Potiphar's house were the same ones he used to manage Egypt's economy. The scale changed. The posture did not. If you like our content, consider subscribing. Or if some topics did not make this list, or there are topics you want us to feature, please leave them in the comments. What would change if you started living like the famine was coming? Not out of fear, but out of faithfulness.